Jason Ray, pronouns are he, him, his, and I serve as the president and CEO of the Wisconsin LGBT Chamber of Commerce, and I'm really excited to be here this morning to share some things, especially as we are celebrating LGBTQ History Month this month. We just had National Coming Out Day last week on Monday, so it's a great opportunity to think about what we are doing to engage our LGBTQ employees. So I've got a relatively full deck here that we're going to go through. We'll try to get through as much of it as we can in the time that we have. We'll be sharing the deck afterwards for those that are interested, but we'll definitely just make time for some questions at the end. We'll get through again as much as we can together this morning. So just a brief overview about the Wisconsin LGBT Chamber. We were founded in 2012, and we're a statewide organization of nearly 700 LGBTQ and allied owned businesses from across Wisconsin. We host more than 100 events a year, including our career fair, for example, that is coming up this Thursday virtually. We've got an online business directory, as well as a job board, and really all around the mission of how are we creating a more welcoming and inclusive.
That's okay. Yeah, I'm just watching a webinar, so you can hop on.
As we look at our agenda today, we'll do a brief overview of the LGBTQ community. We'll get on the same page when it comes to some language, talk about the current status of LGBTQ protections, and then how you can be an advocate for inclusion and what you can do specifically in the workplace. So I always like to start any presentation on diversity with this image of the iceberg model. And the iceberg model shows some of those traits or characteristics folks may have that may be seen and visible, what's above the waterline. But it also shows the items below the waterline. Things like gender expression, socioeconomic status, experiences, mental health. I like to share this and include this in it because I think it's so important as we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion work, to see that there are some things you can see and tell about others, but there's so much you don't know, and you'll never see. And that really, in particular, is part of the LGBTQ community, are traits and things that you may not otherwise see. So as we start, I want to start with just everyone a thought exercise for just a moment. So imagine that you were to go into work on a Monday morning and your coworker asks you what you did for the weekend. Now, you've been with your significant other of the same gender for 15 years, but you aren't out at work and you haven't told anyone. How do you navigate that conversation? What do you say to your coworker about your weekend? I'll tell you, I worked with an individual at a corporate partner of ours who lived this, who was with his partner for, I think, was over 20 years. And every Monday morning when he went into the office and they say, what'd you do this weekend? He couldn't ever say, oh, my partner and I did this, or Jim and I did that, or, it was always hiding a piece of himself. He didn't think he could be out. He didn't think his coworkers would welcome him and respect him and still involve him. So he hid that and remained in the closet at work. And the toll that takes on an individual who has to do that day in and day out and watch their words, watch how they interact, watch what they say for 20 years, even for 20 days, can have a significant impact. So I use this as a starting spot to just think about, where we're at right now. So let's start by getting on the same page. And I'm going to go through some of this very briefly so we have more time to focus on action steps that you can take. So the first is around the definition of diversity versus inclusion and equality versus equity. I always say that diversity is being invited to the dance, and inclusion is really around being asked to dance. So diversity is saying, hey, we want you there. Inclusion is saying, well, what are we doing once we actually get you there and making you feel a part of it? You'll often hear in circles around LGBTQ issues the terms equality versus equity. Equality to me really refers to equal opportunity and the same benefits, same level of benefits for all people. Equity goes just one step further and offers varying levels of support depending upon the need to achieve a greater fairness of outcomes. So, equality has really become synonymous with leveling the playing field. And I think equity really is more synonymous with more for those who need it. So as we look at this work, how are we doing more for those who need it to ensure that they get their equal fairness and opportunity to succeed here. Along with that, 3 other terms that you'll hear me use today multiple times. The first is sexual orientation, which is that enduring emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to other people. Your gender identity is one's innermost concept of self, of how you view yourself as far as male, female, or neither. And then gender expression is that external appearance of one's gender identity. And one of my favorite images here is the genderbread person, which really helps to underline and highlight this more. And you can see, starting at the top with the brain, that gender identity. It's how do you define yourself? How do you think about yourself? Do you consider yourself a man, woman, gender queer? You see the outline, the expression. Do you express yourself in a more feminine or masculine way, perhaps? The biological sex, and then the sexual orientation, the heart. Who are you attracted to? Would you consider yourself heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual? So all 3 pieces, that gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, are really important. And one of the reasons for that is there are different laws in different states and regions that have different protections based on gender identity or gender expression or sexual orientation. As well, some other terms that I will use. I'm using LGBTQ today, which is an acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. Sometimes it might be LGBT, sometimes it might be LGBTQ+, LGBT+. I'm just using LGBTQ today. There are different people use different terms. It is a constantly evolving language, particularly when it comes to the next word on this list, queer, which is a term often used to express that spectrum of identities that may be counter to mainstream. Some people use it as kind of a catch-all, or for those who don't want to exclusively identify as straight or are more gender expansive identities. Queer is a term that is once was much more derogatory and viewed in a negative context. It's really been reclaimed, and we find, especially with some of the college students and younger professionals that we work with, they choose to identify as queer instead. So really kind of re-owning and repossessing that word. 2 others, just very briefly, cisgender, which is a term to describe a person whose gender identity typically aligns with the sex that was assigned to them at birth. And transgender is an umbrella term for those whose gender identity and/or expression is different than cultural expectations based on the sex that they were assigned at birth. I included some terms here not to say, things including lifestyle choice, saying things like, gay marriage, it isn't gay marriage, it's just marriage. But just include here, again, I have that queer as the apostrophe because it's generational of how people will respond to words, to that word in particular, but just some phrases not to say. So I'll very briefly go over an overview of the LGBTQ community in the US. This all comes from a study at the Williams Institute at UCLA. And it shows that in the United States, this was done last year, they estimate that there are about 13 million people ages 13 and over who identify as LGBT. You can see the breakdown here between male and female, 42% male, 58% female. You can see the race and ethnicity breakdown, the age distribution as well. One of the things that it's really important to see is that intersectionality, that it is diverse communities who are LGBT. You can't paint a monolithic picture of what an LGBT person might look like. They are of a variety of ages, a variety of race and ethnicities, a variety of genders, a variety of raising children, as well as different incomes. 25% of LGBT people in the US have an income less than $24,000. 25% have an income less than $24,000. So, and there are some that have a much higher income. So it really is a diverse community. We look specifically at Wisconsin here, and this comes from the Movement Advancement Project. In Wisconsin, they say about 3.8% of adults in Wisconsin are LGBTQ. That there's about 207,000 LGBTQ individuals in Wisconsin. It's 4% of the workforce, and you can see the number then of workers there as well. Again, this is the Williams Institute findings, kind of breaking down ethnicity, race, gender, age distribution in Wisconsin, and it very much lines up and mirrors the national numbers that we showed just a moment ago. One of the things I also like to share at the beginning of a presentation, and I know I'm moving quickly through this, but definitely will share my contact information at the end for those who do want to dive deeper. We do a study every year with community marketing and insights to understand the feelings of the LGBTQ community. And one of the things that we heard was, do you agree with the following statements? And almost 87% of folks said that corporations that support LGBT equality are more important than ever. Almost 86% said companies that support LGBTQ equality will get more of my business this year. That they tend to purchase from companies that market to and support the community. There was one study that showed a while back that LGBTQ individuals would be willing to spend twice as much on a product or service if they knew the company they were supporting was inclusive and supportive of the LGBTQ community. So you do have a very loyal community that is looking to say, how do we feel connected to this? And this here just shows, have you made a conscious decision to make a purchase over the last 12 months due to their outrage employment practices, and 83% made an intentional purchase from a company partially due to their LGBTQ inclusion. So why does this all matter in the workplace? It's great to say, hey, they want to support and buy from you, but why does this actually matter? And it matters because there was a study from the Human Rights Campaign done in 2018 that showed that 46% of LGBTQ workers say that they're closeted at work. Let that number sink in for just a second. 46% of LGBTQ workers say that they're closeted at work. 1 in 5 reported having been told or had coworkers imply that they should dress in a more feminine or masculine manner. 53% reported hearing jokes about lesbian or gay people. 31% of LGBTQ workers say they felt unhappy or depressed at work. And the top reason some of them say they didn't report any of this, they didn't think anything would be done about it. They didn't think anything would be done about it. The fact that we still, today have 46% of LGBTQ individuals, like the example I gave earlier of someone who said that they're closeted at work, has a tremendous impact not only on their well-being, but on the company's performance as well. There was a further study from the Human Rights Campaign that talked about the impact on a business. It was called The Cost of the Closet and the Rewards of Inclusion. And it showed that employee engagement suffers up to 30% due to unwelcoming environments. And you can see in this chart, whether it is, 35% of individuals having to lie about their personal life, 30% feeling unhappy or depressed at work, 27% of people avoiding certain people, searching for a different job, feeling distracted, avoiding projects. If you aren't able to bring your full authentic self to work, you're not able to really deliver for your company. And especially in today's market where it's a global market and you're searching for talent, building that inclusive workspace has a real impact on your bottom line as a company. If someone can't, be their full self, can't be there, you see here that they are feeling exhausted, that they are avoiding certain clients or customers, that they're not able to perform to the level that you may want. So they may leave, which also then forces you to go and research and find additional talent when we could be focusing our efforts on how do we build that inclusion in the workplace. So one of the first ways to do that is to talk about the importance of pronouns. Pronouns in the workplace are one of the first and just initial starting point that is I consider sometimes a signal to the community to say that you are intentionally trying to be inclusive. And, it starts here. If you look at this image, if we were in person, I'd have people raise their hand, we'd vote on things, but, in a virtual space, we do the best we can. But, think for a moment about, if you were to walk up to this individual at work, what pronouns would you use to describe this individual to someone else? What pronouns might you use? Would you use, she, her, he, him? Would you use something else? And I will say, and this is what I would do if we were in person, that it's a trick question for you here. You can't assume what pronouns you're going to use just because of someone's appearance. I have a good friend who their name is Darcy. And Darcy's very clear to share pronouns. I'll use emails as an example. If someone were to email Darcy Smith, about half the time, if not more, Darcy, who identifies as male, is he, him, will get their emails identified as Ms. Smith, that they assume based on one's name, that they assume based on one's appearance, that they can assume the gender identity of that individual. So pronouns are not only important for the LGBTQ community, they're important to make sure that your employees across the board are addressed by the way that they are and that they feel as though that they are respected for who they are. So a pronoun, just as a brief definition, is that word used to refer to the people you're talking or people talking about in the third person, like she, her, he, him, they, them. So pronouns are really important. You can't know, as I said, what someone's are just by looking at them. It's really important to ask someone for their pronouns, and that's really the first kind of basic sign of showing respect for their gender identity. When someone is referred to with the wrong pronoun, it can really have a negative effect and have someone feel alienated, invalidated, disrespected. Now, if you don't know someone's pronouns right away, it's okay to ask. All you have to do at the start of a meeting is say, what pronouns do you use? Or what pronouns do you go by? I often encourage companies, and there'll be a slide later with this, when you start a presentation, much like I did today, use pronouns. Introduce yourself with those pronouns. What you want to do is avoid misgendering, and that's incorrectly referring to someone by assuming it. Now, I will tell you that there will be times when folks might make a mistake. And if you do, that's okay. No one is perfect. I am not perfect in this. I still make mistakes with people's pronouns. If you do make that mistake, apologize and move on. Correct yourself and say, oh, I'm sorry, I really meant this, and continue moving forward. So this chart here is just a sample of some of the more common pronouns that you may see. I think the three that will be most common for folks will be she, her, he, him, his, and then they, them, and their. And I know there are some folks who I talk to who just are curious about the they. That is for someone who prefers more gender neutral pronouns or prefers not to be gendered in a more masculine or feminine way. They is singular in that spot. So there are members of my team at the chamber who their pronouns are they, them, their. So when I refer to them in the third person, it is not she did this, it is they did this, referring to that one individual person. So I'm going to skip very quickly through this section just because of our time together this morning. I have a full deck that I will share with all this afterward, but I start with the fact that there are technically 0 federal laws that prohibit non-discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. There are no federal laws that explicitly use the terms sexual orientation or gender identity for non-discrimination. Now, within the states, Wisconsin was actually the first state in the country back in 1982 to pass laws that prohibited against discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations based on one's sexual orientation. But as you can see on this chart here with housing, it's a state-by-state case. Wisconsin, again, protects discrimination based on sexual orientation, but does not prohibit discrimination in housing based on one's gender identity or expression. And you can see a number of states have no protections at all for that. Same with public accommodations, whether or not someone is, able to use, the restroom or retail store or a restaurant. Wisconsin protects against discrimination based on sexual orientation, not gender identity or expression. Credit is even worse for folks, and access to credit and lending non-discrimination. Many states don't have that on the books at the moment. Now, I say that Wisconsin was the first to protect against it in 1982. And while there are still no protections statewide that covers the trans community, I crossed out employment because there was actions at the Supreme Court last year that really helped open up some opportunities. But while things may not be done at a statewide level in Wisconsin, there are several municipalities and counties throughout the state. This is not an inclusive list by any means. These are just some examples of communities that have passed their own local non-discrimination law to prohibit discrimination based on gender identity and expression to really protect the trans community in places like Milwaukee, Madison, De Pere, La Crosse, and others who went a step further, because at the state level, there is no state protection. And why this is important is, in some of those states we looked at earlier, we might have marriage equality, but you could get married on a Friday and fired on a Monday because of who you love. So it's really important that we do have federal protections. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which enforces Title VII's prohibition on sex discrimination, actually did rule a few years ago that employment discrimination due to gender identity or sexual orientation was considered sex discrimination. That ended up working its way through some recent Supreme Court cases here that was decided last summer that affirmed the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's ruling that discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity is sex discrimination, which is prohibited by the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, but it only applied to employment. So, there is no protection right now from others on, additional opportunities, housing, public accommodations. We did have the President Biden did issue some executive orders to implement those for federal employees, that they're protected against employment discrimination. Builds on the Supreme Court's decision directing federal agencies to interpret that as well. But it's one of the reasons there's an effort right now on the federal level. It previously was the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Now it is the Equality Act, which would help make sure that that sexual orientation and gender identity are explicitly spelled out in the Civil Rights Act. I have heard from several companies asking what's one thing that they can do to help advance equality in our country, and it is signing on to the Equality Act. A number of over 200 or so businesses from across the country, including some major corporations here in Wisconsin, such as Rockwell and Manpower, have signed on to the Human Rights Campaign's business briefing on this to say that they, as a company and an organization, support the Equality Act, which will go much further beyond just employment non-discrimination, but also really focus on housing, public accommodation, credit, all the things so that there can be uniform laws across the country. And one of the reasons this really matters is, in addition, for businesses and organizations, that if you have employees in more than one state, you're dealing with a variety of laws around who's protected where. Those employees are figuring out where they want to go and work based on that as well. So I've covered a lot of background, I think, perhaps too much, but wanted to make sure to give a full lay of the land. But now I really want to talk about how you can be an advocate. And I use the term advocate over ally because I believe allyship is much more passive in nature, and that I really want people to become advocates for inclusion. This comes from my friend Jennifer Brown, her book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader, Your Role in Creating Cultures of Belonging Where Everyone Can Thrive. And Jennifer talks about 4 phases of the inclusive leader continuum. The first phase is being unaware, where you have no basic understanding. Then you move to phase 2, where you're aware, you know basic concepts, but you're not active on behalf of self or others. You get to phase 3, where you're active, you're well informed, you're sharing and seeking diversity when asked or prompted. But then you get to phase 4, the advocate. And this is where you're committed to routinely, proactively championing inclusion in the workplace. And I encourage folks to figure out where they are in their journey and to continue to push themselves forward to say, how do you become a true advocate? I consider ally much more that active phase. Allies are great, and I will never diminish the power of allies. But we need in the workplace are advocates, those allies who are going to step up and actually work to create that change. So here are a few things that can be done, really on a micro level or macro level here, excuse me. And I've adapted these from my friend Rhodes Perry out in Oregon from his book, Belonging at Work. The first of these steps is, commit to continuous self-education. You're all doing that right here, right now. That is one way to make sure that you are learning about it. What you don't want to do in this, though, is expect others to teach you. It wouldn't be, right to ask, any LGBTQ person on the street to help explain what gender identity and expression means. That isn't their job. This is my job. This is what I get paid to do as the head of an LGBTQ chamber, but it isn't every LGBTQ person's job. So that continuous self-education is important. Next is applying an inclusion lens to your everyday work. I like to think of this, many are familiar with the golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated. And I don't think that actually goes far enough. I think it is the platinum rule. Treat others as they want to be treated. So as you're applying an inclusion lens to your everyday work, treat others the way that they want to be treated. Don't treat them as you assume. As well with this, don't assume that you're free from unconscious bias in this. Think about everything when it comes to it and apply that inclusion lens when you look at things. I've seen some companies, as they consider new products or services, there is a step along the product development journey where they do put a diversity and inclusion perspective on it and look and say, how would this impact both, on race, with the BIPOC community, how would this impact LGBTQ individuals, people with disabilities, and others. You want to communicate the diversity, equity, and inclusion business case by being able to share with your supervisors and others why this matters and why it's important. You want to get involved with workplace issues. And finally, looking at leadership opportunities and taking a step. And think of all the ways that you can bring diversity to the table. With this, I really say, don't assume that small actions don't count with it. Don't assume that small actions don't count. I often will get asked, well, is it appropriate, for a leadership role in this work for, an ally or an advocate to step forward into a leadership position, or should we only let LGBTQ individuals serve in leadership positions advocating for change? And I think it's really important that allies there know that they can step up and they can assume that. They are helping make it safe for LGBTQ people to come out at work and be safe. There was one company I was working with where their LGBT employee resource group was led by a straight advocate, partly because some of their employees didn't feel comfortable yet coming out. And that ally advocate helped to create change in the workplace to allow other members of the team to come out and rise up. So don't assume that those small actions don't account. Don't assume because you are not a member of the community that you can't take on those leadership roles and be involved in making a difference. So then on the, those are kind of the macro things you can do. What can you do on the micro level? First, you can offer your pronouns when you start a meeting. Start your meeting with, hi, I'm Jason. My pronouns are he, him, his. You can use gender inclusive language. This is making sure that you're not, looking at, how you refer to people. This is making sure that you are saying things, and we'll share a little bit more in a moment. This is speaking up. This is being visible, be open. This is displaying the pride flag on your desk at work, a little flag or a little safe space sticker or something so that folks know that you're an ally, that you're supportive, that it is a welcoming and inclusive place. As we talk about the sharing your pronouns, I mentioned starting your meeting with it. I encourage folks, tomorrow is actually International Pronouns Day. I encourage folks to include pronouns in your email signature, on your business cards. I actually just saw one of our corporate partners, Kohl's, is having their pronouns now added to business cards and things. So it's a great opportunity for you to make sure that you are addressing people. Sometimes people, when they put their pronouns in their email signature, they may include a link to things like, why this matters behind their pronouns, and link to a site called mypronouns.org to walk through and help educate others on why they're including their pronouns in their email signature. And it is absolutely okay when you start a meeting, when you meet with somebody, sit down for coffee, how should I refer to you? What pronouns do you prefer? That is absolutely okay, and that's a great way to help build that relationship and show that you are being intentional about inclusion. Now, as we offer, you want to use gender inclusive language as well, and we really need to shift that language to avoid further assumptions. So, for example, you don't want to start meetings like, hey guys, or good morning ladies, but simply try hello or good morning. You want to watch your sirs and ma'ams. I'm sure there are other phrases like this that you can think of, but in your daily life, I would encourage folks to start thinking around how do you use gender inclusive language, not assuming someone's gender identity? How do you make sure that you are saying things that would encompass a perspective of people, particularly as we talked about that ICEBERG model at the beginning of the presentation, where you don't know these items about people. So how do you make sure that you are addressing folks in a correct way? So things to think about, as you're doing there. And then again, something that you all can do on your individual basis, in addition to your choice of language, is supporting LGBTQ and allied businesses as well. We've got a directory on our website. But what can you do in the workplace then? So there's things that you personally can do from your language, your choice of vocabulary, the way that you interact with others. What can you do in the workplace? One thing is you want to modernize harassment prevention trainings with realistic and representative scenarios, including those reflecting LGBTQ issues in the workplace. You want to look at developing gender transition resources for employees. If a member of your team were to come to you and say that they're about to begin the transition, that they're trans and are going to present a different way on Monday, gender expression wise, do you have a policy? Do you have procedures in place that would guide you through how to do that? I know a number of companies, have developed, tools to say, here's how we would, notify. Here's how we'd make sure updates are done. Here's all the steps we would want to go through. So having those policies in place. It also, as we talk about language, it's creating inclusive policies reflecting current nomenclature. So this also includes going through and saying, looking at your personnel policies, and is it, always he or she shall? I'm working with several companies that are working right now on reviewing all their employee handbooks and removing any gendered language in that. Are also making sure that if, they may have at one time put, gay and lesbian, which was the common term in the 90s. Are they working to make sure that they are reflecting that today? In addition, including LGBT demographics and diversity and inclusion data. Are you asking on your HR systems for a self-ID of employees? Are you collecting that data so you have a better understanding of your workforce? Making it voluntary, of course, for those that want to do it, but are you collecting that data? And I think it's really important at companies to ask senior leadership to sponsor and support LGBTQ organizations, events that they may be internal events like an employee resource group. They may be more external focused, but we have seen time and time again the impact that having senior leaders at companies, senior executives who are allies and advocates show their support can go a tremendous way in increasing a sense of inclusion and direction, that it really comes from the top of a company. And it's important for individuals to be advocates to get those executive leaders to do that. As well, in the workplace, you can evaluate your benefits programs for inclusion. So you're looking at healthcare coverage, leaves of absence, disability benefits, same-sex spousal benefits, domestic partnership benefits still might apply for some individuals who have chosen not to get married for a variety of reasons. But have you looked at all those benefit programs for inclusion and said this is fits for everyone? Or if you look at them through that inclusion lens, do you see, they're these really are very heterosexual focused, and we really need to evaluate these. Training all employees, not just managers or lead workers, is really important. Particularly, we're finding more and more with individuals who come at companies that have, frontline staff that might engage a customer, perhaps at a bank branch, a hotel check-in, whatnot. Really educating all employees about, LGBTQ inclusion work, proper use of language. That is a representative of your company. And if you're only focusing on managers or lead workers who focus on this, you're missing out on a real opportunity to help promote inclusion. The other thing you should do in the workplace as well is making forms as inclusive as possible. Are you asking for pronouns on your form? Are you providing opportunity for folks to provide that? Are you allowing a self-ID? I know many companies are using HR softwares that will allow them to collect a voluntary self-ID to get a better understanding of their workforce. Are you asking for perhaps legal and common name on there, or the name that they go by? So perhaps specifically if it's a trans individual, They may not have had a legal name change ceremony yet, but have a different name that is their common name that everyone knows them as. But they may still need that legal name for HR purposes. So are you asking for both on forms? And are you including multiple genders? And specifically, I say genders and not sex on this. That what you want to ask for is what gender as someone? Do they consider themselves male, female, non-binary, or other? Those are the three that most companies want to start with. Other things, advise employees that they should be able to use the restroom that conforms to their gender identity, not their biological sex. And in that, don't require the use of a unisex bathroom based on perceived or actual LGBTQ status. One of the best things that you can do is, as you're creating, updating buildings, renovations, doing that, creating gender neutral bathrooms or spaces as you go. I know we're working with a couple of companies right now that, as they add new locations, are making sure that the restrooms aren't gendered. There's no reason for them in a small location to have both a male and a female that's just a single stall, but rather using a gender neutral space for all individuals. You can support LGBT business and employee groups, LGBTQ organizations, encouraging the use of LGBTQ businesses in your supply chain. We work with the National LGBT Chamber that certifies LGBT-owned businesses that I know many companies are eager to add into their minority, women-owned, veteran-owned businesses. Are you posting on LGBTQ inclusive job boards so that employees are out there who are looking for companies where they can bring their authentic self to work? Are you reaching folks in that way and showing that you as a company are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion? So those are a lot of things that I covered. I try to keep it high level enough that hopefully you take something away, but I encourage you to ask questions and continue to learn, to make sure, especially if we hit International Pronouns Day tomorrow, that your pronouns are in your email signature, that you are practicing using gender inclusive language, that you're supporting LGBTQ and allied businesses, but most importantly, that you are being an advocate for full inclusion in the workplace and are finding ways to encourage leadership to put that inclusion lens on everything. And I'll close with saying, it's an ongoing journey. There is never, excuse me, an end to it. It is constantly learning and evolving. So don't feel like you have to be there tomorrow. It's ongoing. Take a few steps at a time. A few steps goes a long way in really creating that welcoming and inclusive community for your employees, for your customers, and for anyone who interacts with you. So here on the screen is my email, my phone number. Feel free to reach out if you have questions, perhaps that we don't have time for today, but that you'd like to learn more of, or would like to just chat more about things you're doing. Please feel free to reach out, and we'll make sure that we share this afterwards with folks. But with that, I want to take time to open it up for questions that we might have from individuals. So I think we can do that now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jason, for all of the information. I appreciate it. It was a great presentation. Lots of great information and insight into this topic. We do have a question, just came in the chat. Jamie would like to know, what was the Y pronouns web link that you had mentioned?
Yeah, yes, the site is mypronouns.org, I believe. So it's a very simple website. I've seen a couple companies use that in their email signatures just to help explain to folks, why it matters and to help give more background at mypronouns.org.
Perfect. Thank you.
Can I also does that also kind of explain for people who may not be aware of what their pronouns are or want to identify which ones those are? Is that also on that website? Does that guide through?
It does, yes, it does. It talks about what they are, how to make them, how to share them, how to understand them, and other resources there.
Thanks so much, Jason.
Absolutely.
All right, and we will open it up. If anyone else has any questions, by all means, put them into the chat. You can raise your hand. Otherwise, you can unmute yourself and ask away. All right, Jason. Well, it looks like you covered all the bases in your presentation. It was a great one. So thank you again for joining us. I really do appreciate that. I will definitely be getting this information out to all of our registrants. We recorded the session. I also will share the presentation itself, and we will take it from there. If you have not signed up already, we do have the 4th of 5 presentations coming. November 16th, we will be joined by Sheboygan County's own Charm Dare as a DEI practitioner and member of our local SHRM organization as well. So with that being said, thank you once again, Jason, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone else. And we will see you next time.